The most available person in the room is never the most valued one. Gracián knew this 400 years ago. Almost nobody wants to hear it today. In 17th century Spain, when the royal courts of Europe were packed with advisors, poets, priests, and politicians all competing for the same scarce attention, a Jesuit priest spent his career quietly studying what actually made some people irreplaceable, while others, often more talented, were overlooked entirely. He wrote his observations in short, sharp maxims that circulated in secret among the powerful. Not because the ideas were dangerous, because the ideas were true, and true things about power tend to travel carefully. His name was Baltasar Gracián, and the central observation running through all of his work was something elegant in its simplicity and genuinely uncomfortable to absorb. Value and availability move in opposite directions, always. The Spain of his time was a society of fierce competition for limited positions. Noble houses, the church, the courts, the merchant class, every tier had more people wanting in than there were seats, and the standard advice was to work harder, be more agreeable, show up more consistently, make yourself useful to as many people as possible, become essential through ubiquity. Gracián watched what actually happened to people who followed that logic. They became furniture, reliable, taken for granted, consulted when needed and forgotten in between. The more available they made themselves, the less anyone had to value the access. Today, we have different words for the same trap. We call it being a team player, being responsive, being low maintenance, being easy to work with. And all of those things can be genuinely good qualities, until they become a pattern that trains everyone around you to expect your best effort as a baseline, your time as infinitely available, and your opinion as something that will always be there whenever they get around to asking for it. So what was Gracián actually pointing at? He grew up inside institutions that ran on reputation. The church, the universities, the royal patronage system, none of these rewarded raw talent in a vacuum. They rewarded talent that was perceived, talked about, and strategically positioned. He understood from an early age that two people of equal ability could have completely different outcomes, based not on what they could do, but on how they were encountered. And the variable he kept returning to was scarcity. Not artificial scarcity for its own sake. Something more nuanced than that. He observed that people who were difficult to access, not rude, not arrogant, but genuinely selective about their time and attention, generated a specific effect in the people around them. Those people tried harder. They prepared more before conversations. They valued the exchange more when it happened. They spoke more carefully about the person afterward because the interaction had felt like something worth having. Compare that to the experience of someone who is always available, always ready, never too busy, never hard to reach, never protective of their focus. The conversations feel cheap because access felt cheap. The opinions land with less weight because they're always on offer. Nobody prepares before talking to someone they know will always have time. Gracián wrote one line that cuts straight to the center of this. Let your rareness increase your value. Not your talent, your rareness. He wasn't dismissing talent. He was observing that talent without scarcity is like a restaurant that never turns away a customer and never has a wait. The food might be excellent, but something about the limitless availability signals that the excellent food is probably not that excellent. Or at least, you can always come back later. There's no urgency. No sense of having secured something worth securing. He was describing something real about human psychology that hasn't changed. We assign value partly based on what we had to do to get something. The harder the access, the higher the perceived worth. Not always correctly, but consistently. Now, here's where this gets uncomfortable in a way that's worth sitting with. You probably undervalue yourself in certain relationships right now. Not dramatically, not in a way that's obvious. Just through accumulated small decisions over time. You respond immediately when a slower response would have been fine. You say yes to requests you should decline, not because you want to help, but because saying no feels uncomfortable. You volunteer information, opinions, and effort before anyone has asked, because waiting to be asked feels passive. None of those individual decisions is wrong. The pattern is the problem. The pattern says, my time and attention are always available to you. And once that message is established, it is very difficult to unestablish. People rarely raise their estimation of someone who was always available and suddenly becomes less so. They usually just feel confused or slightly annoyed at the change. Gracián would say, the time to establish your value is before it's needed. Before the relationship is formed, not after. The scarcity has to come first, or at minimum, has to be present from the beginning. What does this look like practically? Not performing unavailability as a manipulation. That's a different thing, and it backfires. What it looks like is having genuine standards for your attention. Projects that deserve full investment get it. Conversations worth having get your complete presence. Requests that do align with what you're actually good at or genuinely care about get a clean, calm no. The person who can say no without anxiety is always more interesting than the person who says yes to everything. Not more likable, necessarily, more interesting, more dimensional. There's clearly something they're protecting, something they value, some internal standard that isn't up for negotiation. That quality generates curiosity in ways that constant availability never does. Gracián also wrote about what he called the art of creating expectation. Not by promising things you can't deliver, but by letting your full capability reveal itself gradually rather than all at once. The person who shows everything immediately leaves nothing to discover. The person who consistently surprises has something the first type never will. The experience of being underestimated and then surpassing that estimation. Think about the most compelling people you've encountered in your own life, the ones who stayed with you. Almost certainly they had a quality of reserve, of not giving everything away immediately, of having depths you were still discovering after many conversations. That quality isn't coldness, it's selectivity. It says, there is more here, and you'll find it when the moment is right. Gracián watched lesser talents outperform greater ones his entire career. By the end, he had a very clear sense of why. The greater talents assumed their ability was enough. The lesser ones understood that ability needs to be encountered in the right way to be valued correctly. He was right. And it still applies to everything. Your career, your creative work, your relationships, the way you show up in any room where your presence either registers or gets taken for granted. Rareness isn't about withholding. It's about having enough internal substance and genuine standards that you simply can't be everywhere, for everyone, all the time, and you're not pretending otherwise. The most available person in the room is never the most valued one. You already knew that. The question is whether you're acting like it. Subscribe if this landed. The next video goes deeper into Gracián's rules for reading people before they can read you.